Good evening, good evening, good evening. That's what I'm gonna keep saying. I'm so excited to have my sister on. Like it's been years. I want to count the years that we have known each other. But tonight she's coming on as what I want to say my expert, because she has completed her doctoral studies um around the topic tonight, and I want her to be as raw and honest as possible about consent. So welcome to Healthy Holy Conversations. It keeps saying lift moment on the men, and I don't know how to change it, except for to come on and do it. But that means maybe me and Xavier need to come back on. He would love that if we came back on. But this is Healthy and Holy Conversations, and we have Reverend Doctor. I love to say it, Reverend Doctor Tamika Holder. Like it just makes me feel good, even though I can call you Reverend Doctor, my friend. But that we as we start tonight, this is a topic um that we don't talk about in the church, else we wouldn't be bringing it on here. We wouldn't, and this is something that we don't get to say. Um, Dr. Holder, I'm gonna say it because it just feels good to me. Dr. Holder is a pastor in Philadelphia. I want to make sure I announce that. And she has background around working with individuals in the church. She's a church baby. So she know all about it. And she good in Baptist. So we we gonna talk real good. So but this topic I believe stretches across um even beyond ecumenical. I believe this conversation in itself is interfaith. I believe this conversation around consent goes across any platform, any space, in my opinion, is around public care, pastoral care, and public health. There should be a conversation around consent. And I have gotten slammed recently about talking about ethics in church. One person even said there cannot be a church ethic. And I believe that consent is a part of a good practice, a best practice, and an ethic that the church needs to have. So without further ado, because I want us to maximize this time, because again, this is a topic that we don't really get to talk about too often. And so we're gonna talk about it real good tonight. Hey Sora, hey legalese, please. We got Natasha Robinson watching tonight. So, but as we go through and talk about it, y'all please chat it up. Y'all ask Dr. Hold the questions. Look how I threw it back at you to me.
Please,
y'all,
please
y'all
do.
ask questions tonight. And so my question, can we just define consent? Because I don't even know if Black faith community know. We don't, that's a dirty word. So I don't even know if we have a real definition for it, a good definition for consent.
So I want to open up by saying thank you for the opportunity to be able to share about my work. It is indeed a labor of love, and as you said, I am a church baby. I can't think of a time in my life that I was not a part of church. From like 2 years old on up, like I've been in church, and so church has my heart. It's been a part of very pivotal in very positive ways and in some very negative ways. So I feel qualified to say that I love the church, and I love the church enough to push us and encourage us to do better and to be better and to live into what God is calling us to do. And so I want to open in answering your question by offering a definition that comes from Dr. Laura McGuire in her book, Creating Cultures of Consent. And she uses this definition, which I think is fairly comprehensive. And the definition is: consent is above all respect for the dignity, personhood, and well being of every living thing. It is not simply asking for or receiving permission, but holistically seeing each person that you interact with and wanting them to enthusiastically and wholeheartedly choose whether or not to interact with you. And so a lot of times when we hear about consent, we talk about this yes or no, or maybe even a maybe. And so I want to open us up by thinking, like, if it's anything other than somebody telling you yes, then it's a no. Like, and also looking at body language, there are folks that say yes, and their body language is like this, and it's closed, and their body language is saying no. That's a no, even if their mouth is saying yes. And so as we talk about this topic of consent and continue to dive into it, I'm excited again about the opportunity. Please drop questions in the chat. But certainly, as we were talking prior to, like, this is definitely a thing that we need to talk about. I think we were more consent minded and oriented as we were first coming back from being at home. And now that we are no longer staying at home and that we are regularly interacting in faith-based spaces, that people have slipped very quickly back into the comforts of the norms. And I want to invite us to slow up and to revisit some things. Though when we think about the safety that we were engaging in these practices of giving space to one another, I want to also encourage us to think about the safety that comes with us asking, the emotional kinds of safety. We were looking for physical safety before, but I want to invite us to think more about emotional safety, also physical safety, because there are people that don't want to be touched, but even more the emotional safety of considering whether or not somebody wants to interact with you. And as well, this is not just for the church. This is for any kinds of gathering spaces, whether it's a sorority or fraternity, some workspaces that have become super comfortable, and other spaces where people come together and there's the possibility of physical contact, for us to begin to think more about creating cultures and norms of consent.
Whew. Okay, so Tamika that came in high and heavy. She gave y'all this definition. I hope y'all wrote that down. If not, go back and watch the replay. You really need the definition of consent. And you said this about 3 times. Did the person give you permission? Did did you even ask them? So in order to get permission from somebody, normally you have to ask, like, may I do something? And I appreciate that you talk about emotional safety. So kind of looking at it from a hierarchy of needs standpoint. We were so excited to get back into church, like excited. People were jumping back into after COVID. People would jump, but we didn't even check our emotional safety around coming back into and touching. So here are these base needs. Like I need human contact, but how am I defining that for my safety? This is moving up in that Maslow hierarchy of need. So as we talk about that, what does that mean to ask? Because I don't know. Again, these are things, not trying to insult faith community, not trying to insult anybody, but as a people, we have had to live inside of our bodies without being asked for emotional safety, physical safety, social safety, spiritual safety. We were not asked. We were told, we were made to, we were forced to do everything in these Black bodies. So what does that look like, or what does that sound like? What is the real ask? Because as a pastor and as a faith leader in your community, you are really big around the ask, really big around even the hug ask. You say, like me, we laughed about this earlier, and we laughed about it earlier this year around, I would tell you no on a hug. That's what that's what Tamika said. I tell you no on a hug. So what does that ask look like, or what's a safe ask?
So I want to offer that this work around creating cultures of consent is a collaborative one. And so, in plugging the blood, sweat, and tears that I put into my doctoral work, I invite us to consider a 4-part discussion guide and trying and being co-creators of community. And so we understand that there are established norms in church. There's an expectation around greeting people with hugs and kisses. Some are holy and some are very unholy. And so us acknowledging the norms that are already present, but also us acknowledging, yes, there are ways in which they are positive and helpful, but also us acknowledging the ways in which they have been very harmful. And so how do we create a norm together where we make space for people to say, I don't like this, and that we respect people's bodily autonomy. And I also understand from having conversations, I'll say I just had a conversation with my therapist about this, and we talked about people having to deal with rejection when you tell them no. And so when we work together to co-create a space, hopefully that will bring down the emotions that come with being rejected, but also helping people to come to an understanding about, like, respecting bodily autonomy. This is my body, and I do get to choose who I allow to be in my space, who I welcome into my space for whatever reason, whether it's just because it's my preference or because I don't feel comfortable with you. Because if we are honest, there are people, whether it's known or there these hush conversations that have been had on the low to stay away from deacon or brother or even sister because their hands go a little too low, they linger too long, or their kisses, which seem to come off as holy, somehow find their way from their cheek to your lips. And so us creating these spaces where we're like, let's take a step back and acknowledge that different people have different preferences, and let's honor what people's preferences are. That's a place of entry, but it's a very comprehensive thing that we need to have a conversation. And again, like, we need to co-create the space for this kind of collaboration.
I love I love the collaborative approach, and I love the co-creation. Um we got Natasha Robinson, so I will call out. She is really clear about the church needs an ethic, because if they had an ethic, they could get sued for a lot of the stuff that they doing. And so I think that 4-part piece is really important. So I wonder if we could take pieces of that, because y'all, after this, Dr. Holder, because I just like to say it. I mean, I love saying it. My sister, a doctor. Like, we're gonna get her information, and if you're watching tonight or you watch the replay, bring her to your space. Like, it does not make sense to have something this valuable, something this valuable, and someone who knows how to use it, who has created it, who has worked in collaborative, not to bring it to your space. Like, that's crazy. So she mentioned something. That's why I want to talk about pieces of it. We have been church babies, right? And this is where the conversation gets really hard tonight. And there has not been consent, where the hug lingered too long, where the hand slipped down where they didn't need to go. And I'm not just gonna say men. Like, I know men who've been abused by women, and it started with the church hug. It started with saying, "Oh, you're a handsome young man," So this is going both ways. Like, how are we working with people? Because now there's a fear of consent, and what I mean by fear of consent is, I don't even know how to say yes or no anymore. I just get quiet because I'm supposed to trust the space. So as we move into just talking about, what was some of that collaboration look like? Does that collaboration look like building a space for trust and building a space of bravery for people to determine their own safety?
Absolutely. And so so in the 4 parts, what I do is build off of or coming to and establishing a common language. So we talk about things like boundaries, safety, trust, and the like, so that we can all have a common understanding of the language that we come into. And I invite, like, so this would be kind of like a small group setting, maybe 5, no more than 10, to help build relationship and rapport and to build the trust that we're talking about. For people to talk about their experiences, and that sharing, it will help us to be able to have come to like common ground and understanding, which I think is absolutely necessary for us to build these kinds of spaces where we center consent, and so people can understand, like, hey, whether the person's had negative experiences or not, we need to come to a place of being better about hearing, and not
Ooh.
just listening, but actually hearing what people are saying, being present, not pushing out the distractions, and taking in what folks are actually saying, so that we can operate in healthier and holy ways.
Listen, let's stay right there. Like, we're not finna move fast. Look, for all my people who watching this churchy, I can't tell you the first. I couldn't tell you the because I didn't have a. How can I phrase this? I can't tell you when my childhood pastor started to listen and started to hear. He was real quick to speak, but wasn't quick to hear. And so most people, I've talked about my story enough. My mother and I went with my father. My father had some mental health challenges. He had some other stuff going on, but it was an abusive household. And going to the pastor, we're asking the pastor for help, and he could not hear that. He literally told us how we needed to function based upon his understanding of Ephesians chapter 5. And so, but this man also, without consent, is giving my father advice about how to work and do, instead of bringing us in together to hear what's going on with the family dynamic. So, sitting in a space of hearing, how can our leaders, how can our community leaders and the people listening tonight, what does it look like to listen? Like, because I don't know if this is something in Black community I've even heard a pastor, a leader, anybody say, hey, we just need to hear. Like sometimes we don't have an action to it. We really just need to be in a space of listening. I've heard it in chaplaincy, but not just offering it overall in community. So what does it look like to just hear as a part of the consent space?
So I think, especially for folks that serve in pastoral leadership, there is often an expectation that the pastor knows all of the answers.
Whew.
And I will openly commit and admit to all of the folks who will watch this video and those who are on now that my degree, my doctoral degree, has proven to me how little I know. That's what I learned. I know a lot about consent, and I learned a lot about the experiences that people were having, but I do not. I know a very microscopic amount of things, and I think that the other part is part of being truly pastoral and not trying to be an authoritative figure, someone who is controlling of not just the church and their own household, but has influence over and at other people's households, is stopping to realize that you are God's emissary, that you can be someone to help break and disrupt cycles that are harmful if we stop to hear what is going on and not be so quick to speak. As often happens in conversations, folks are not listening to hear what's happening. They're preparing to respond even before the person's finished their sentence. And so it's important that we stop trying to race ahead so that we can have the answer that people expect us to have, but to be present with people and to hear what they are saying, and not just what's coming out their mouth, but also their body language, to be present with the tears and to be present with the other actions that oftentimes happen in spaces that let us know that something strange is going on. And we can't just operate business as usual. We have to start to think about things and take advantage of other professionals and experts. I met with someone in a pastoral setting, and they told me that they were talking too much in the setting. I was like, no, I'm not here. You are, and you provide a level of expertise on your life that I do not have. So as we are talking, many times people have the answers to their own problems. I also recognize as a pastor who is bivocational that my expertise is not in mental health. My expertise is not in counseling. So if someone has an issue, I will meet with you 2, maybe 3 times. Then I'm referring you to somebody who will be better equipped to support you and to guide you, because it's above me. And I know what my lane is. My lane is, I've been called to pastor, to shepherd. I am not called to be a counselor or a therapist. And I have plenty of good therapists, social worker friends that I will happily refer somebody to so that they can get the adequate and proper treatment that they need to help them deal with whatever they are dealing with.
That's why I rock with Tamika. Let me tell y'all something. Let me tell you something about Pastor. Y'all, did y'all hear that disclaimer at the end? I know I ain't called for that. That's not it. That's not it. I'm gonna give you 3 times. And I'm like, honey, let's find you somewhere else. Let's do this. I can't. I'm not from Philadelphia. I want to say John so bad, but I can't. Is it John?
John.
That John. Like, let me get you another John, because this ain't it. Like, but listen, that is the beauty of knowing, and that is such a consensual act. Hey, I know, one, that I'm listening to you, I hear you, and I know this is the first part of that consent. I know I'm not going to be able to. How about if we can travel together to someone who can give you better help? Here's the answer, yes or no. Like, take that weight off of you, pastor. Take that weight off of you, church leader, and connect. Start making community connections. I think, Tamika, that's huge. That's a big part of the consent issue, is that we have convinced or we have been convinced in our communities that pastors literally know everything and they have to. I still make this joke. He said this is about 5 years ago, but it was a pastor in our community. He now partners with mental health professionals. He has a mental health conference every year, but his joke, to us, it was 2 mental health professionals that went to him. And he said, I am a wonderful counselor because Christ is a wonderful counselor. I said, okay. 2 years later, all the stress, all the stuff that hit him, he was like, yeah, no, that's not for me. And so, he had to even do an inward consent to realize I'm just not equipped to do that and build community partnership. So that's big, y'all. The hearing. Here's the skills of the listening piece. You actually are listening for what you can and cannot do to help your person that is in front of you. That is big. That's active listening. And so an offering to do that, and I don't know, in our communities, faith leaders, how often that's given, and how often we give ourselves permission to do that. So this other piece around consent and moving through it, because sometimes we just think about consent as touch, but let's get back to that emotional space of consent. Like, what does that look like to get consent emotionally? Because this healthy, holy conversations. Church got a lot. Faith communities have a lot around emotionalism. Like, I got to do something with them. I got to tag them. I got to touch them. So what does it look like to have this consensual emotional space as a faith leader and as someone who's working in the space of consent and permission to work with somebody?
So just revisiting the definition that I use, that consent impacts all interpersonal interactions. And so what I have witnessed and heard is that under the authority of saying that God told me to tell you, people have done things that have often been harmful. And so if we are looking at creating cultures of consent, it might be something as simple as, I received a message from the Lord. Can I share it with you? Because you have authority again in church does not mean you get to bear down on me or use that authority or that position to do whatever you want to. People do that frequently. I don't think it builds the relationships and the kinds of communities that we are trying to build. If we are really trying to be disciples and build communities of faith as God calls us to build them, like the kind of love and the interactions, as we look at how Christ interacted with other people on the way. Now, I'm not going to say for 100% certainty, because there were some spaces that were kind of, I need to revisit all of the gospels, but a number of the places in which Christ interacts with people, he asks for permission. I don't think that it's 100%, because someone also pointed that out, but frequently that was Christ's trend in his work. And so similarly, when we start doing things like laying on hands or can I pray for you, but also set your ego aside if the person says, no, you cannot, because people have the right to say yes or no. And us being confident and clear and okay with hearing the no. And if it's time, or if that person is certainly supposed to receive that word from you, because they may not be ready to receive the word that we think that is for them. And it may actually be for them, but they may not be ready to receive it. But it's not our responsibility to just pour it on their head as if it's like a cup of water because we got it.
Okay. So this is the end of the conversation. We're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. Cause you messing with people in that altar call when you said
No.
you need to.
I mean, also, even with the issues, as we were chatting about prior to coming on, it's just like, why are we sharing people's business from the pulpit and we don't have their permission?
listen. So this, we're gonna hang out right here. Give us 5 minutes, y'all, because I know some of y'all just sitting with it. One, what is that? Because I feel like it should be a consent form that you have to sign when you getting ready to preach somebody business, because your sermon finna sound good on the text. I feel like it should be a consent form to sign when you finna blow your breath in front of me. And lay hands in this magical moment and you can knock me down. I mean, that's just me being funny, y'all. But in real life, that is an issue from the pulpit to preach other people's stories with no consent. That is a hard, like, I have witnessed horrible moments on the mic where pastors have preached people's business. And this is supposed to be a private situation I'm having with my pastor, right? This is where I scream about ethics in the church. If you're gonna act like a therapist, then be one. Now I'm like, get you some HIPAA forms or whatnot. So bad thing, and we finna dig into it around consent to tell my story, because pastors will preach you with no problem. And it make it, they will find the text and preach you. I have seen it. It's still happening. So how do we maneuver with that around consent and working with the pain that comes when we don't have consent with individuals who this has happened to? This is, for me, this is right up there with physical violation when you violate and preach my story.
I mean, it goes back to that emotional safety. And I think Sharon Smith said it very aptly. It's about respect. Um, Folks can't just be out here telling people's business. That does not create a, without their permission. It does not create the space of safety. We always talk about church being a safe space, and this invitation to people thinking about creating cultures of consent is an invitation to think about how we can move closer to making it safer, at least for everybody, not just certain bodies, but everybody. Because one of the things that I really found um, is that children are often disrespected in church spaces. They are treated as if they are valued less. And folks, adults, well-meaning, oftentimes will be like, "Go hug the pastor," and the child may or may not want to hug the pastor. Like, my church primarily meets virtually, but there was a young lady, she's a teenager who came to Christmas Eve worship last year, and I asked her, I was like, can I give you a hug? And she gave me a hug, but I just like this idea of like pushing kids to do things that they may or may not want to do. It's confusing. Um, Christian Smith said in a video that was posted from a sermon when he was talking about consent, um, that I thought was really profound. And he talks about the ways in which many adults teach those that are under their guidance that consent is like a switch that you switch on and off. In certain spaces and certain people it's on, and in other spaces it's off. And so like the family members, especially as we approach the holiday season, the family members that we will go hang out with, and people will be like, "Go hug your aunt," or "Go hug your uncle," or "Go hug your cousin," and the child clearly does not want to hug that person, and yet some adult is still pushing them to like, "Go give them a hug, go give them a kiss." How about we allow children's internal systems to guide and govern the way in which they want to interact with other people? If I'm a safe person and a child says they don't want to hug me, it's fine. So how about we work on making spaces so that it's like we don't make kids do things, because it sends mixed messages about their voice even being respected. So even at a young age, you're being taught that my voice doesn't matter. And we don't want to raise children to think that their voice doesn't matter, that their voice is valuable and what they say will be heard and it will be honored and respected.
All right. Well, pause. Y'all take that in. Cause I know I grew up in a culture where you go hug that person, you go sit on that person's lap, you go do whatever. It was no, you trust the process around it. And kids are like, I don't know, I don't want to do that. Um, and I guess the sit because we're talking about consent tonight, y'all. If you just joining us, thank you for coming. I see y'all. We're talking about consent. So one of the things around faith communities and consent too, because we just sit on that for a moment, is also honoring the discernment of children and other people, honoring what they're telling you. In my community, there was an individual, and we knew kids did not want to be around this person, but he was so nice, he was so kind. He worked at particular spaces that Black families are just gonna go to. Like, you're gonna have your local funeral home, you're gonna have your local space where Black people gather, and nobody would listen, like nobody, so just even, I don't even want to say if it has to be consensual, but it seems like it needs to be that consent around discussion around discernment. And what do we tell not just our young people? We churches it operates different. So our people sometimes don't realize they can use their own discernment, not just children, but we have young adults that don't realize they can use their discernment. We have women that realize they can't use their discernment. And I'm specific about women because the church is still top heavy with men. And then you have some men that don't realize they can use their discernment, and that actualizing consent in order for touch, for story, for anything to be passed or shared with permission. How do we approach that conversation? Because I know respecting one another, that's the big thing. But how do we find the space to approach that conversation where it won't feel like everybody being attacked, or it won't feel bad, but it feels like we can have a collaborative effort to create some level of bravery and safety for people in our congregations?
Yeah, and I want to say before addressing that, the respect is a really interesting thing in church. And it depends on who is asking for the respect and who is offering that respect. And we respectful until we don't get our way. And then we can get real disrespectful and indignant. Um, I think we can move closer to creating a culture of consent, which I want to keep bringing back up and keep highlighting by creating spaces where we can feel safer. And we do that by building community. Um, and we have to do that intentionally. Uh, Again, back to the discussion guide that I created, those small groups that I invite those who engage with it to look at are built around building community, again, to take down some of the walls. So, folks, as I was sharing with you before, based off of the topic of my work, believe that I'm anti hug. And you know, I'm not anti hug. I am particular about who I let in my space because I have that right. I don't want to smell your cologne or perfume for the rest of my day. I don't want to be squeezed because I'm not that big, and so people want to squeeze the breath out of me. Um, but I I understand the value of touch. Scripture talks about it. Psychologists, mental health professionals talk about the value of touch, and I also understand what happens when touch is done inappropriately or in unwanted ways. And so, again, creating these small groups to build a space that has parameters to it, that has guidelines and rules that we agree to, so that we can have these open conversations and come to a common ground, a common understanding about concepts of consent, what it means to be in community, what are the values, or what about this community do you value the most. And so when I think about my church experience, the things that I have loved about community is about being in a faith community is that folks have demonstrated tremendous amounts of love to me and support. Like whenever I go back to my home church now, like it feels like I think of the Cheers commercial where everybody knows your name, and like they always are excited about the great things that they've heard about me. And I always feel welcome and I feel loved. And I also know that there were times in church where people have said some things and done some things that have made me um, understand very clearly why folks who decide to walk away. Because if I was not clear about my call and the fact that Jesus loved me and this is the space that I'm called to serve in, that I may have walked away too. And so, how do we create the spaces of coming together, having conversation, um, building that trust? Small groups help a whole lot. And again, there are facilitated conversations that talk about let's look at scripture. Let's look at the scripture and the text outside of it being preached from the pulpit where Bathsheba was doing something ungodly, even though she was doing what she was supposed to do. She was following the purity rituals of that time, and David, lacking self-control and self-discipline, made a phone call. Let's look at these texts together from different eyes, and let's talk about them and think about them and how they might relate to our communities, and how harmful these kinds of theologies and beliefs can be, and what are some different ways we need to approach them to create environments that are welcoming, that are loving, that are caring, um, and so forth.
Li- Listen, so Dr. Holder's actually running this conversation tonight. I'm just sitting here like y'all because brought up something really big, the theological tenets around consent. So I'm gonna throw out Dr. Danielle Behiro. She threw us off in class about a month ago, like mind blown, because she was asking us where can we find consent, or where can we find where in the text we see that people are assisting with suicide. Now, this is a conversation you have as a D-man student, because we're talking about pastoral care. So that's not where we're going tonight. But what I want to know in the text, where is there anything? Because you said Jesus asked, and Jesus did. Going through the Gospels, Jesus literally said, "Do you want to? Is this something you need?" Jesus asked. And so, is it in the theological spaces, theological tenets using the Bible, or there is any other holy, divine, sacred text that talks about consent?
I think the model that I reference as far as Jesus asking for consent is an illustration, but we often, excuse me, most frequently see a lack of consent, and we see a bunch of violations and people doing harm by rejecting no's. We see uh, the sister who told her brother, don't do this. Like she had all types of different methods that she was using to persuade her brother to not violate her, and yet and still his heart and mind was focused on having what he wanted. We see a number of illustrations of that in the biblical text, and I think those illustrations, though we don't often preach them, and I personally don't think that they more, unless you do very careful work. So being very intentional and thoughtful, having professionals present for people who you might be opening up wounds for, folks who may have been violated decades ago and who have never talked about their trauma. So if you're going to do that kind of work, you need to be careful and intentional in your planning to make sure that you can tend to the needs of your congregation and being a good and faithful shepherd. Those kinds of texts, though, are invitations for us to think about ways in which we might violate people's consent and things that we need to do to bring in safeguards and guardrails to protect and guide people, to create the kinds of spaces that we want people to feel welcome in.
Yeah.
Another thing that I want to point out as we are thinking about Jesus asking for consent is the story of the woman with the issue of bleeding. And it was not until I was doing this work, I've read and heard that passage so many different times, but it's the response that happens. So the woman was looking to get what she needed. She wanted to touch the hem of Jesus's garment. She does not ask for permission. That's one thing. She does it. But what I found particularly intriguing was the response of the disciples. And they respond by like almost being dismissive. And that's often what happens when people say, like, though Jesus does not feel like it's a violation, it is. But he does not respond in a way in which he was violated or harmed. But oftentimes when people are violated or harmed, folks respond like in a very dismissive way. Or they will blame the person that's the victim of the violation.
Yeah. Well,
So we got to stop doing that. We have to look at and examine
blame.
carefully our cultures.
Yes, the blame. And can we stay right there? Because she was just she too had a need. Like I looked at that text and I had to maneuver my way out of my social work eye, because I was trying to make it, I was trying to preach it. But I had to keep coming back to this text about a year ago. And I was like, because she has a need, she didn't, it wasn't even just she reached through. She bulldozed through a crowd with an issue. And so even when we're sitting in spaces of consent, teaching about consent, it when you have a need, I think let me phrase this well. when people are sitting in spaces of need, they often don't think about consent. I love how you just said that, like, people either blew off the person that needed to, can you touch me? Because Jesus did turn around and like, who touched me? Like something was bothered right there. It wasn't just the pull of virtue. Like, what this touch is not one that was welcomed initially. And then so, though you have a need, though you have something, there still has to be a way to not violate my humanity. And so I know that language sounds hard, but that's what happened. Like, you pulled something out of me, you did something, and it didn't feel well. And I think the lack of consent also brought an interruption in the moment. And we like to treat that so miracle and happy, but it interrupted the progress of what Jesus was doing and how the movement was going. And I think that offered us a pause to even talk about what was the consensual touch. Though she got what she needed, what was taken away for her need to be met without permission? That would be something. Again, I love how you said, make sure that your congregations are ready for those conversations. Make sure that you do good consent with your congregation to go to that level of interpretation and homiletic work. Because that again is another, we need consent to disrupt someone's theological thinking around miracle work too. So and it's not even a question. I think that's more of a statement. But coming back to it, how do you maneuver? Because the unwanted touch was healing, but I don't know. I don't know how Jesus regained strength. It was very dismissive. And we don't find
So,
it in the text.
no, we don't. But what I find the text offering, which I'm glad you mentioned it because it had slipped out my mind just that fast, was that there are people that have a need. There are folks that do need and want physical contact. And you ought to get that need met from someone who is willing to and wants to meet that need. Unfortunately, church can often be a space where people do push and bully to get their needs met. And that can be very harmful. I'm thinking of somebody from one of my old churches, and she was a sweet lady and I still love her very dearly, but I also was not in a good space. And she was trying to get a hug from me and I was trying to be like, no. And she was just like, you want to give me a hug? Like, that's not what I needed in the moment. You got what you needed, but I certainly did not get what I needed and ended up feeling worse by that situation. So get your needs met with and by other people that are willing to and able to meet your needs. And we can do that by asking people. Yes. And I co-sign what Anetra Pastor Anetra Jones is saying, that sometimes it's
Gotta give
pastors.
our titles tonight.
Yeah,
No,
we allow people to violate our boundaries because of their need. And I certainly echo and understand that, like in the sanctuary or the quote unquote the sacred space of the church or what other sacred space, but also in other ways, which also prompts us and probes us to think about, like, especially as pastors, we want to feel helpful. We want to do the right things and assist as much as possible. It also reminds me of the need for us to do our own individual work, to examine those things that motivate us and making sure that we're getting our needs met in healthy and holy ways, so that we don't seek to get those needs met in ways that could end up being harmful.
let's sit right there. Come on, pastors coming through. Like, I think sometimes the violation in that consent, and now this is not Margaret even thinking social work or ministry, is that we don't have our needs met. So, moving this to leadership, leaders, and that's, I really, man, like, leaders allow themselves to get violated because we think that's our job, like, to consistently get pulled on, to consistently get touched, to consistently have to show up in spaces that violate the things that, because we haven't done our work to know that we too have boundaries. And because those boundaries are not met, then we move into other spaces of violation. And I'm
But
not.
also because our boundaries are regularly violated, and because we haven't been, like, in many spaces, like models, for not models for ministry, are a lot of them are full of examples of people not having clear boundaries, people overextending themselves, having 15-20 hour work days, and doing a whole bunch of different things that are not good for us, that don't model like the kinds of ways in which Jesus models for us, to take a Sabbath, to take a break. Uh, I'm amazed. I need to know what Jesus did in order to be able to sleep in the back of a boat in the middle of a storm.
Listen,
I need to know that secret.
I want to know the secret. Like, what? How
Was
you
it the
be
was it the
trusting me?
fish? Was it the wine? I need to know what it was.
What was you doing? And I think, like, you just hit something really hard, because what does that look like when you are taught loose boundaries? We're talking about consent tonight, and we came up under people with loose boundaries. Like, I'm gonna tell your story. I'm gonna preach. It might be touch that happens. We can't lose boundaries and limited access to care, and not even having a definition of self-care. Like, there's a brother I love dearly in my community. I love him. I fussed at him like 3 weeks ago at a funeral, and I told one of the deacons, I said, "Hey," it was not consensual. I said, "Hey, have his wife pack his bag, put it in the back of your trunk, and then magically drop him off at the airport and hand him the flight." Because he is pulled on by community in so many ways, and watching exhaustion. And so, the fear that I have, this is my own personal fear, is like, what does exhaustion look like for him if he passes out? What does it look like for him if he has to violate standards so that he can just get some care, like the woman in the text? I'm not saying that she was wrong for doing what she was doing. She was trying to find a way. She broke all the rules, by the way, and I'm not disagreeing with how she broke them. But what does that look like when you have to start violating community care, community standard, in order for your need to get met because you went so long with the issue? How do we help with that? Because the models we have invite us to go long with the issue, to go long, to almost suffocate in our issue.
I'm not going to pretend like I have an answer because it's a thing that I struggle with. I think in my struggling and my wrestling, it is important that we have a community of friends, of sisters, of people that help us to evaluate our models, and the ways that we are living, and if they are healthy, and if they are helping us to be all that we are called to be. And friends who can tell us, yo, you need to stop. You need to take a vacation. You need to get somebody else to preach for you. I'll preach for you. I've had friends who reminded me to get a break. I was gifted with a massage gift card. And those things are, some of those things are, they're temporary and they help a whole lot. Especially if your neck is hurting so much that you can't turn. That's a whole different conversation. But it begins by stopping and evaluating, uh, and setting those boundaries, or resetting them and establishing them. And I think the part of the work of consent is just understanding that even when you say yes, it doesn't mean yes eternally, that you can say no, that you have the right to change your mind. And some of us may need to change our mind about some yeses that we've said. And to say, because I know I've said some yeses and I really needed to say no. And I actually went back and was like, I would like to do this, but I don't have the capacity to do it right now. And so I think some of the ways, especially pastorally, that we can take care of ourselves is really coming to a place of being like, is this going to allow me to be all that God has called me to be? I'm not called to be the savior. I'm an instrument of God, that I'm a vessel that God has placed gifts inside of me. But ultimately, I do not have the capability or the ability to save anyone. That is the work of Jesus. And
That
as
is
I would say to my colleagues at work when I log out at the end of the workday, and if I'm on vacation, um, don't call me unless it's an emergency. And if it's an emergency, you really need to call 911 because I can't do anything about it. Um, and it's unfortunate, as Sherry has noted, like we don't want our bodies to get to the place of shutting down. And some of us, and I will admit that I often find myself in that category of almost getting to the place of shutting down in order to actually say, no, I need to stop. I'm doing too much. Um, Again, but Jesus teaches us about living lives of balance, of getting rest and balancing the or having the ebbs and flows of rest and work so that we can show up as our best selves and do quality work. Right now, I'm participating in and leading in a book study on sacred self-care by Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes, who invites us to some very small yet valuable activities. And so, if you haven't seen that, I certainly invite you to take a moment and pick up that book. But it certainly invites us to think about some ways in which we might be able to show up better for ourselves, so we can show up better for other people and not violate our boundaries. We're more apt to say yes to some things that we need to say no to when we are vulnerable and compromised because we're exhausted.
So I first of all, I didn't know consent was gonna lead to self-care, but I should have known that because that's what consent is. Consent is an act of care. And for real, promoting Dr. Walker Barnes' book. This is a theologian who's also a therapist. Y'all, that book is delicious. So go get that. And it's really small acts of care that you like. She wrote a book about this. Yeah, she did, because guess what? We don't know. We don't know them. So and it's really just the pieces of the book I've read really are acts of consent for each thing she's asking you to do. I'm consenting to taking care of myself. And when we move in spaces of consent, then we will understand, as it stated, we will respect the consent of others. Because I don't want to be violated. They don't want to be violated. So how do we move and do? And then we won't do things to try to keep us well by draining others. So we will be rational. So I'm gonna bring back up David and Bathsheba. That's been, I guess, a buzz. Somebody put that out. I even talked about it. Just bad theology. How we put that spin on it, and people will say, "No, it wasn't bad theology." He recognized his lust, but there was something about the lack of consent in David's entire life. And how do we start? David never consented to being disowned and forgotten by his father. Y'all can go read that in the text for yourself. He acted like he didn't even existed. Here's where that issue with consent started. There was not a consent form that was signed for a lot of things that David did. So when it came down to I can just take what I want, I don't even know if consent would even been in the frame of mind. And I know we're using an ancient text to talk about consent, but let's look through, because sometimes, as it's been stated by a lot of our leaders in this chat tonight, I think I have to do that. So I'm not even worried about consent because I got to get that done. I think I'm the person that has to. I love what's been said. I've been voluntold to do things. Like I have to do that. So it's still not a yes. Um, and Dr. Holder, she said this thing hard. Your yes is not an eternal yes. Y'all need to put that in the chat. Somebody need to put that on their computer screen. Margaret needs to put it on her computer screen. It is not an eternal yes, which means I have a right to come back on a no. I have a right to come back with a no. No, I'm not doing that. No, we're not gonna make that happen. No, that's not gonna work for me. And some of us probably sitting in shock with that tonight. Like, I can say no. Yeah, say no, because that's another space of consent. And when you sign consent forms as a therapist, we're supposed to get consent forms signed every so often by our client. Like, it's not an eternal consent. It's not a forever consent because I saw you 6 times and then you come back 6 months later and that's the same consent form. No, you got to sign some new consent forms. And when you're looking at consent, You got to see what's now consensual. Consent changes often for people because they have new understandings of their bodies, their minds, and their soul. So I'm looking. I could talk about consent all night. Like we tap this. This wouldn't an hour is not long enough, I don't think, for consent, but we tapped it. So and I'm looking, man. So if y'all got questions, put them in the chat. Tamika, Dr. Holder, let me say it right. Because we gonna use titles tonight. We earned every title we got. What is something that we could leave around consent? Like, because you have given us so much, and shared your life's journey, your life's work around consent, and given us your heart's work. And so, what is the one nugget that we need to take up out of this tonight around consent?
One though, dang.
No, you give as many as you want. I was just because I was going to tell people they need to contact you, and they need to pay you to come and talk about something at the church. This dirty C word called consent. They need to get you out there to their spaces.
Absolutely. And I would love to connect with people so that we can talk some more about consent. Because I think that one of the key nuggets that I would like to share is that we have to talk about consent. Because so much of church culture is centered around other people having control and doing things without permission. It Thinking about and examining and creating cultures of consent is going to be disruptive. The idea that someone will ask you for a hug and you have the choice of saying no, someone's feelings are going to be hurt, and we'll have to have a conversation about it and find ways to talk about how that person is able to choose whether or not they want to hug you because it's their body. Yes, this is a space where it's been a norm, where we hug, and we are working to create a space where those who choose to not hug have that choice and that option, and you have to reconcile being okay with that. I think the other thing that I would like to share as we're winding down is that we can change things. As I was thinking about this topic earlier, there was a time when there were things that were not that are now a part of church. I remember a time where there was the deacons started worship with testimony service, and now a lot of spaces have praise and worship. There was a time when we didn't have drummers, and God forbid, there was a time when talking about rap in church was anathema. But times changed, things shifted, and so there are ways in which we can shift our cultures and our norms that, if we are intentional, if we remember, if we recommit and refocus to creating spaces where everybody is welcomed, everyone is appreciated, whether they choose to hug you or not, or if they want a fist bump or a high five or a handshake or don't want to be bothered at all, we can create those spaces together, if we are willing and open to doing that.
It's the openness and the willingness. Black faith community has shifted, has changed, and some of it is just the understanding of who we are as human. Dr. Philip Butler said it at a conference I was at recently. We are discovering who we are as humans, and we are discovering who we are as beings, and we're learning how to maneuver as human beings. Like, he separated it out. And so it was a time in history where consent wasn't even on the tip of your tongue as a Black person. No such thing as you did what they told you to do. You moved how they told you to move, and you got voluntold and violated at the same time. Dr. Holder, I love you so much. Like, since you have walked with me for years, and walking in this journey too. And y'all take, these are wise words. So this is what I need from Dr. Holder. Please let the people know how they can find you and get you, because you are busy. You passed the whole church.
I do. Um, Yeah, my social media presence is horrible. If you want to connect with me, it's easiest to connect with me via email. It's my first name, middle initial, and last name, Tamika A. Holder at gmail.com. I mean, you can look me up on Facebook, but you'll just find a lot of my shenanigans that are filled with sarcastic memes. So I invite you to join me via reach out to me via email, and we can connect and talk more about consent, which is something I truly am deeply passionate about. And I wanted to tag in real quick as you talked about history and its impacts on our present. So we think about the ways in which not having options and the ability to say no because we were told to do something under the threat of being harmed or losing our lives, that kind of history has crept into our church, and we need to think about that and consider how that kind of history is showing up in the ways we show up in church. And we don't want to bring that history into the ways in which we interact with people right now.
Ooh. So that's a part two. I got part twos this year. Like y'all, this is second season, a real second season of Healthy Holy Conversations. It's not just a rant anymore. And we bringing on the experts. So again, I hope I put that up right, Tamika. Um,
Yes, perfect.
okay. How people can contact y'all, please get with Dr. Holder, who has the information around consent. We are entering back into church space, and it is not the same. It does not look the same. The pew don't even smell the same because it didn't air it out. We are entering back into a world where consent is necessary, and we need consent too. And if you are a faith leader tonight, I hope you take into consideration what Dr. Holder said. You two deserve consent. I'm finna go pick up my Bible and go read this text again. Because man, the lady, she had a need, but faith leader, you two need to operate in consent. Don't be dismissive of your own needs. And Dr. Walker Barnes ain't asked me to plug nothing. So I'm plugging this book, not just because Dr. Holder said it. The book is great. And so it is Sacred Self-Care by Dr. Shanika Walker Barnes. Y'all go get that. Support Black authors, Black community, because Black people are talking. And we got good things to say. And so Dr. Holder also has some articles out there. I'm gonna post them. I started to post them all today, but I was like, no, she got some stuff. So y'all go find her. Again, thank you so much. And then this is what I forgot to do. I know we're running over a little bit, but this is what I forgot. Y'all support the conversation. Like I know that people, this is what we do. I have to ask now. This is very comfortable, but I don't want people to come on this platform and we don't have anything to give them. So support the conversation if you can, however that looks. I promise you that it is going to help aid and do what we need to do. We have an annual conference every year, and our conversations, we try to do around 8 conversations each year leading up to our annual conference, because these are topics that are not heavily talked about within Black faith community that are so needed. So again, good night. Y'all get with Dr. Holder. I love her. Y'all have a good night. We finna get out of here. Y'all stay on the mend. Y'all stay healthy and holy. Go take this information and put it into your community so that people can understand, hey, consent is necessary. We gotta have it. Y'all be blessed, and we will see you